Good evening, and welcome to another edition of the FTTC podcast, sponsored by Waste Pro USA, home of the 2023 NFL quarterback. We are your home for breaking news and breaking balls in the fantasy sports world. From touchdowns to tailgates, we've got it all covered with a dash of witty banter. I'm your host, Jason Stankiewicz, and I'm joining you here from a place where football is as foreign as the concept of trash, the beautiful Singapore. On today's podcast, we're going to discuss all the FTTC results from week one, including a terrific performance from Take a Stand, bouncing back from a significant amount of criticism, and the beginning of what could be a season to forget for the commissioner. We'll also update you on some league news, including a big update on Steve's punishment. We'll talk about some early contenders for the worst pick and who might be looking to make a move. So without further ado, let's go ahead and move into a little matchup recap from week one, shall we? Now, obviously, the big story from week one, Take a Stand with a huge 124-point performance, silencing all the critics around them. Going into the season, there was a lot of talk that maybe Mr. Blazer and Team Take a Stand were not adequately prepared, that their head was distracted, that they weren't quite ready for the season. That clearly was not the case. 124 points from Take a Stand, as mentioned. Christian McCaffrey, Devontae Smith, Chris Olave, three of the highest performers. Many in the media were doubting the overall credentials of Take a Stand. And to be honest, those doubts were furthered by the decision to start Sam Howell in week one. Personally thought it was a real risk. Obviously, Howell is not a top-tier quarterback. It appears clear that Take a Stand will be focusing primarily on streaming quarterbacks this year. But Howell repaid the faith shown in him, outscoring several of the top QBs. I mean, he outscored Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts. Basically, all the quarterbacks that were drafted in first 3, 4, 5 rounds performed them, or outperformed them, including, Jalen Hurts. I thought that's a pretty big deal. One of the final fun notes, though, on Take a Stand here in the week one performance from Mr. Blazer's squad, the bench for Take a Stand actually outscored week one's Village Idiot of the Week, nice catch Blanco Nino, putting up 62 points, a solid bench performance, but really putting to shame Mr. Kokoris, over at the commissioner's office. Really adding insult to injury for his team, making sure that Take a Stand was really able to send a message saying that, specifically to the commissioner, saying that I'm not gonna concede to you. I'm here to stay. I'm here to win. Clearly, Mr. Blazer is trying to send a message to those at the top. Now, moving on to the Village Idiot of the Week. As mentioned, the commissioner, he found himself 6 feet under late Monday night with a frankly embarrassing 57-point performance. The 1-1, Justin Jefferson, who everybody knew he was going to take. He takes Justin Jefferson. I think it was kind of the default pick there. You really can't go any other way. But the 1-1 Justin Jefferson was his lone performance. Every single other member of Nice Catch Blanco Nino disappointed. Most notably, Josh Allen's 3-pick performance, which was a direct contributor to the loss for Nice Catch Blanco Nino. And it was not a good matchup in any sense of the word. Coming up against last year's runner-up, the D's-Asters, who had an almost equally embarrassing 71-point performance. And 20 of those 71 points came from the Jets defense. I think we were all expecting a little bit better. It was forecast to be a high exposure matchup, very volatile. And it certainly was volatile, especially with the Josh Allen versus the Jets defense matchup. I mean, realistically, that could have gone either way. But, being that you had the quarterback up against the defense, that basically makes every interception worth 4 points. And I think every touchdown is worth, upwards of 6. So, obviously, it was going to go one way or the other. It definitely did not go the commissioner's way. But, it's pretty clear that the D's-Asters, despite scoring 71 points, ended up as the smarter manager of the week. And to that, we salute the D's-Asters, and we will continue to heap criticism on the commissioner and his week one performance. We'll even touch on his shotgun a little bit later today. Moving on to some of the other results from week one, Team DS and Jordy's Ghost followed Take a Stand's lead both dropped over 120 points. Some of the top scorers for the week were on these squads. You had Tyreek Hill, Dallas defense, Brandon Ayuk. Some very solid performances from those guys. And honestly, if I'm the Deebo Samuel owner, I'm a little worried about this. And one of the things that we'll touch on too a little bit later on is Roadrunners Naz and the way things have shaken out here early on with some injuries, and it's very possible that they could be looking to make a move here. But moving on to a couple of the other matchups, Strickland Propane outscored about 2/3 of the team in the league and took an L. Almost any other matchup, Strickland Propane wins outside of the top 3 teams. But it took the L to Autobot Draft Squad, who admittedly came into the season very unprepared, did not feel that he had a good draft, was certainly reevaluating some of his choices early on. I think he even asked for a redraft right around round 5. It was pretty clear that he was unhappy with the way that his picks went, but ends up pulling it out with a nice 104 points and taking the W. And honestly, like I said, adding some injury to insult for Strickland Propane, it's possible we may see them dumpster dive in the waiver. Tossing some bids in on Melvin Gordon this week. Strickland Propane lost J.K. Dobbins for the year. J.K. Dobbins, of course, a risky pick. He always seems to be hurt for the majority of the year. He's sustained some freak injuries at this point, but you got to wonder and you got to feel for the guy. You got to wonder, though, if maybe this is, his last run out there, having torn, I believe, his Achilles again. Just terribly unfortunate for J.K. Dobbins and Strickland Propane. Looking at things now, it's very possible that they're a little short on running backs. I think they were counting on J.K. Dobbins to be a primary contributor this year. Looking at them now, you've got Brian Robinson in there, DeAndre Swift, who could potentially fill in. But outside of that, the running back room is pretty thin. It's very plausible that we could see them looking to make a move in the very, very near future. Moving on here. One of the contestants for worst pick of the draft, Vic Vinegar, making the pick of Travis Etienne, showed that perhaps his decision to take Travis Etienne early was actually justified. Travis Etienne ended up week 1 was RB5, put in a solid 18-point performance. Honestly looked like an RB1. And it was certainly much earlier than people thought he should go, but sometimes you got to reach to get your guys, and it's clear that Vic Vinegar valued Travis Etienne and his ability. On the other side, though, I can't say that Vic Vinegar's out of the woods yet for worst pick. Drake London, who came into the year touted as the next receiver ready to explode, a guy who people think has a significant amount of talent. He's got great size, really should be a top-tier receiver. He came out with a 0-point performance. It's very possible that tosses Vic Vinegar's hat back into the ring for worst pick, which is certainly going to be a shameful award this year. I think whoever ends up with the worst pick is right down there with a loser. Maybe it ends up with the same person. It contributes to their losing season, but I think that they should be victimized, humiliated, and really laughed at for the majority of the year. So we'll make sure that we are constantly kind of updating on where people are at with the worst pick and who's really struggling. But we'll touch on that a little bit later. Now let's get to some other poor performers of the week. Sneaky Pete, or maybe we should say Stinky Pete, was also victimized by a top-tier receiver with a 0-point performance. T. Higgins, it's something that Stinky is all too familiar with. T. Higgins last week of the regular season, needs to come out, needs to just throw a few points on the board, and Stinky's fine, not going to finish last. He comes out, plays, I think, the first 2 series, and they pull him from the game, tossing up a big fat 0. So Stinky is well familiar with the 0-point Higgins performance, and Stinky Pete should also be in contention for Village Idea of the Week this week. A 64-point performance. Guys, we got some pretty low scores here, and generally an underperforming week in the NFL, some ugly football, no doubt, but surely we have some smarter managers in this league and some pretty low 60-point performances. The expectations are definitely going to be much higher going forward. Finally, the closest matchup of the week, separated by a mere 1.2 points. Stinky pulled it out against Mike's Lucky Charm after the Buffalo defense really failed to show up against the 2020 Polynesian Player of the Year, Mr. Zachary Capono Wilson. The Buffalo defense really should have run ragged once Wilson came into the game there, but really couldn't get anything going. A big late touchdown sealed their fate all they needed was maybe another sack or two, and they pull it out. But Mike's lucky charm, I think, is right to be terribly disappointed with that result. They were coming into the matchup looking pretty strong. And, Stinky made some good choices of special teams. Jake Elliott had a huge week for Stinky. Baltimore defense really came out looking strong. So the special teams really saved it for Stinky. And that just kind of adds a little bit more pain to the defeat for Mike's lucky charm. It's always a slap in the face when you get knocked down by a kicker in a defense. Anyway, that's the roundup on our week 1 matchups. You can expect more of this going forward, as we'll talk routinely, giving kind of a recap of the previous week. We'll get some thoughts from some members in the league. But let's go ahead and round up on FTTC news. So, the first point here that we want to address, obviously, the big news of last week, Mr. Steve Blazer of Take a Stand has chosen to totally redeem himself. He's agreed to do the G League punishment with the Windy City Bulls. Obviously, a big 180 from previous discussions, and the league is certainly excited to see Mr. Blazer don the practice outfit. We were speaking to former coach Jim Boylan a little bit earlier, and it's, he said to believe that Mr. Blazer has the potential to scrap his way to a roster spot. He called him a gym rat, said he has a real leader mentality, something that Jim Boylan sees as indispensable. He really thinks that a guy who can get out there and get up and down the court for 40, 45 minutes is super valuable, and a guy that they think could make it in the G League. And, it remains to be seen if Take a Stand will stick around in the FTTC if they do, in fact, earn a spot on the Windy City Bulls. But regardless, I think we're all excited to see what Mr. Blazer can do. As Strickland Propane has highlighted previously, he's got a smooth shot, great handles. We expect him to be a real contributor out there. And so it'll be certainly a prideful moment when he takes the court for the first time. Moving on to the next item, the commissioner, he took a bit of a discount on his shotgun punishment for week 1, dumped about half his beer on the floor. And, those are some nice floors in that NAS group funded apartment. I can't imagine that he would want to ruin them, so it must not have been intentional. But, he claims he slurped it off the floor. Many in the media believe he was instead sacrificing to the beer gods, hoping to save what could be a very long season for Nice Catch Blanco Nino. I think looking at that roster right now, there's not a lot of talent there. I think his team in particular, it might not be ready for a bounce back. There's not necessarily a lot of room to grow. It could be a very long season. If Josh Allen and Justin Jefferson aren't able to carry the load, the talent is pretty low after that. So not sure what we'll see. I'm sure the commissioner will make some moves. He's generally pretty good about, being active on the waiver wire and usually tries to swindle at least one member of the league with a trade each year. So we'll see what kind of moves he can come up with. But I would look to see him be aggressive early on in both the trade block and the waiver wire. Finally, last point of news for the week, scoring at an all-time low for the league. FTTC investors are said to be questioning the commissioner's methods. They're unhappy with the output of the league. This is meant to be a high-scoring, high-performing league. Really some top-tier managers. But scoring has been down so far. And, noted commissioner sympathizer Brian Durrani of Roadrunners parentheses NAS has advocated for a solution of 6-point passing touchdowns. Some of the media believe that to be aggressive, ill-founded. Honestly, that major changes aren't needed. That the managers need to step their game up for week 2 going forward. While others have possibly touted a second kicker as an option to increase scoring, really add some more volatility and make some of these matchups a little bit more interesting. Moving on to our next segment, let's talk through some early contenders for the good old-fashioned Worst Pick Award. Now, we mentioned T. Higgins and Drake London, both of them tossing up zeros, or some early frontrunners, but I think the real frontrunner here might be Cooper Kupp. I mean, that pick came with a ton of risk, going in the 3rd, 4th round, right around there. It was never going to be, it could end up being a huge steal. It could have ended up being a huge risk, and it looks like it's leaning toward the risk side. Cooper Kupp going on IR, it definitely has the potential to cement him as the worst pick. Who knows when he'll be back? If he doesn't come back, I think you got to give that one almost the award. Burning that early pick, it's a big risk, but that it carries that risk, and you have to respect it. And so if it goes wrong, you deserve to be humiliated for it. You can't also overlook Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, and Joe Burrow. I mean, 3 of the most disappointing QBs in week 1. hopefully there's some growth there, but single digit points from those guys just isn't going to cut it for their owners. They're really looking for anywhere 20 to 30 points, particularly as we mentioned in Nice Catch Blanco Nino's case. Josh Allen needs to lead that team 20, 30 points every week for them to even have a chance. So if he's not getting that, it's going to be a long season. So we look for them to bounce back. I'm sure they will. There's some talented players, but right now those are your front runners for worst pick. Moving on to our last segment here, making a move. Looking at the teams in the league that may be potentially looking to make a move, Roadrunners Nats potentially eyeing a short-term move to bring in a wide receiver as competition for Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson was touted as one of the most exciting receivers coming into this year. Easy first round pick, maybe very, very early second round pick if he flowed out of the first round. But with Aaron Rodgers at the helm, people thought the sky's the limit for Garrett Wilson. Obviously, with Rodgers going down now, Naz Group is said to be absolutely devastated by the Aaron Rodgers injury. Naz does believe that there is some hope, though. Very reliant on the home treatments that Aaron Rodgers is scheduled to go through. He may even go on another ayahuasca vision quest, lock himself in a cage and have some mongrels really massage that Achilles back into place. But the noted 9/11 denier, he probably won't be back this year. But Naz Group is optimistic, and if that's the case, and Garrett Wilson still has something of a ceiling. But if not, Naz Group may be looking to make a move early on, potentially swinging Wilson elsewhere, or making a very aggressive move on the waiver wire. Naz has already been aggressive, burning through $10 waiver budget. So we're seeing some aggression out of this manager. It wouldn't surprise me if that continued. Moving on to the Disasters. They're kind of the next team that we're looking at to potentially make a move. I think they must have come to a realization after week one that their RB room is less than ideal. 5 RBs on the Disasters. They scored less than 20 total points in week one. The comment right now out of the Disaster camp is that they're assessing internally whether they may look to make a move. They have a lot of wide receiver depth. They could easily swing one, potentially getting an RB2 back, RB1 if they really want to be aggressive. There's definitely some opportunity for them to make a move, though the Disasters have never really been one to panic early on. I'm sure we'll see them lay some cards on the table before too long. And finally, the last person we're looking at potentially making a move here, not quite ready to enter panic mode, but Sneaky Pete may be aggressive in both the waiver wire and the trade block, as early as week one. There was a strong underperformance in week one, as we previously mentioned. The overall squad depth might not be there. People were pretty critical of the Sneaky Pete draft, thinking, hey, this wasn't quite what we were expecting from this manager. Mr. Rahali has generally been a reasonably shrewd drafter. But looking at the team that they came out with, they made big bets on Bijan Robinson, who honestly panned out in week one. Alexander Madison was fine, but the rest of the team was really a disappointment. I would not be surprised to see this manager aggressively look to add a top-tier wide receiver or a top-tier running back to complement some of the pieces in that team. Separately from Nice Catch Blanco Nino, I do think Sneaky Pete has some upside left in this team. There's definitely some room for them to improve, but it wouldn't surprise me if they try to supplement with some early moves. And on that note, that'll end this episode of the FTTC podcast. Thank you again to all our listeners for tuning in, and we look forward to returning next week with a recap of the G League tryout and, of course, a breakdown of early waiver wire decisions and fab budget spend. I'm your host, Jason Stankiewicz. Thank you, and have a great day.